She mocked him on national television, laughed as the cameras rolled, as if the man across from her, J.D. Vance, was just another relic clinging to the past. Outdated views, she called them. The audience chuckled. Pundits tweeted. Headlines crowned Jasmine Crockett the voice of a rising generation. But 3 days later, in that same chamber, J.D. Vance quietly rolled in a $200 portable TV, plugged in a single USB drive, and pressed play. No speech, no drama. Just 8 minutes of raw footage. From a factory town forgotten by headlines, abandoned by trade deals, and betrayed by the very policies Crockett once defended. By the time the screen went dark, even her own staff couldn't look her in the eye. Because sometimes history isn't rewritten with applause, it's restored with silence. And while the story you're about to witness is a dramatization, inspired by real voices, real issues, and real emotion, it isn't bound by literal fact. It's here to reflect something deeper. What it feels like when the forgotten finally get seen, and the powerful finally get asked to listen. So the question remains, what was in that video that made the nation turn and her legacy unravel? Let's find out. Don't scroll past this. Every second of this story matters, and by the end, you'll know why. The hearing room inside the Rayburn building was packed tighter than usual. Not with journalists, they were always there, but with something rarer, expectation. An unspoken electricity flickered between the rows of polished desks and paper-stacked podiums, as if everyone sensed that something was about to ignite. C-SPAN cameras hummed gently overhead. Phones were quietly tilted upward from staffers' laps. Outside, a small crowd had gathered on Constitution Avenue, watching on a live stream projected from a nearby truck window. The subject of the day was dry on paper, federal corporate subsidies and international trade enforcement. But inside the room, the subtext was warfare. Cultural, economic, generational. On one end of the dais sat Senator J.D. Vance, posture upright, brow slightly furrowed. His blue tie looked a bit too tight. To his left, a folder labeled Case Study, Monroe, Ohio, rested unopened. He hadn't spoken a word yet. Opposite him sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett in crimson. Sharp eyes, smooth voice. Her aides flanked her like a press team prepped for prime time. The light caught her pearl earrings just enough to sparkle when she turned her head to the cameras. She didn't look nervous. She looked ready. The chair banged the gavel lightly. Representative Crockett, your time. She adjusted the microphone with a slow, deliberate hand. Her lips parted, not with hesitation, but with precision. Senator Vance, what you continue to call protecting the American worker is nothing more than clinging to a version of America that no longer exists. Steel towns, factory floors, mom-and-pop dreams. It's over. We're in the age of tech, clean energy, and global collaboration. A low murmur swept the room. She wasn't done. Frankly, you're clinging to yesterday's America, Senator Vance. Get out of the way. Boom. You could feel it. The collective inhale. The soundbite landed like a slap against marble. 3 camera flashes fired in rapid sequence. CNN's congressional correspondent leaned forward in her seat. One of JD's staffers blinked twice, unsure whether to reach for their rebuttal notes or just hold still. JD Vance didn't flinch. He didn't blink, didn't lean into the mic, didn't raise a brow. Just sat there, as if her words passed through him like wind through iron bars. His stillness said everything, or nothing. The silence stretched a second too long, long enough for pundits to clip it, long enough for the moment to become a meme in the making. Twitter would later freeze-frame JD's stoic expression under bold white text. When you remember the truth, but wait for the right time. Crockett smiled faintly, satisfied. She sipped water, not from nervousness, but like a lawyer savoring a win before the judge bangs the gavel. But something shifted in the air. JD slowly, almost imperceptibly, moved his hand toward the closed folder marked Monroe, Ohio. He didn't open it. He just rested a single finger on its edge. That movement, subtle as it was, sent a chill through one junior staffer watching from the corner. Because those who knew J.D. Vance, not the senator but the man beneath, knew that he didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He waited. And when he moved, it was with something far more dangerous than anger: intention. The room may have moved on, but the cameras didn't. What Jasmine Crockett said that day didn't just echo through Congress. Within hours, it exploded across the internet. By the time the hearing adjourned, the first upload had already hit Twitter. A low-res clip, shaky at first, filmed from the upper gallery. It didn't matter. Within minutes, the moment caught fire. Crockett's words, clipped down to 14 seconds, delivered like a closing argument before the jury of America. "You're clinging to yesterday's America, Senator Vance. Get out of the way." No background, no JD rebuttal, just the takedown. Cut clean, served cold. By hour 3, the hashtag was trending. Hashtag Crockett crushes. Late-night anchors ran with it. A CNN panel called it the best unscripted line of the quarter. TikTok creators layered Crockett's voice over Beyoncé beats and meme montages of rusty factories fading into oblivion. A viral remix cut her line between clips of collapsing coal mines and booming startup offices, as if to say, old America out, new America in. One creator added fire emojis to her microphone and slow-zoomed her eyes. Caption: Queen energy. Meanwhile, J.D. Vance's inbox flooded with opinion headlines. Is J.D. Vance finished? The face of a party that refuses to evolve. The last stand of Rust Belt rhetoric? He was called out of touch, stone-faced, irrelevant, even emotionally disconnected. A New York blog posted a side-by-side photo of J.D. and an old, corroded smokestack with the caption, "Guess which one still has a future?" But in the midst of the noise, something curious happened. A still image, almost unnoticed at first, began surfacing in comment threads and Reddit reposts. It wasn't Crockett. It wasn't the mic drop. It was JD's face, captured mid-silence. Neutral, steady, eyes locked. Not in defiance, but in something more complicated. Reflection, calculation, weight. A user on X posted it with the caption, "The look of a man remembering something important." No filters, no fire emojis. Just that stare. Quiet, unreadable, oddly moving. It spread. Slowly at first, then faster. Underneath the wave of celebration, a new undercurrent emerged. Some began to ask, why didn't he respond? Others dug up past speeches, clips of JD walking abandoned mill floors, eulogies for small towns no one visits anymore. A user commented, "This man buried his mother from an overdose and still believes in second chances. You think one viral moment will erase that?" Another wrote, "Crockett won the moment, but he might be playing for something bigger." Still, the majority remained hypnotized by the hit, by the flash, by the certainty. People like certainty. Crockett had delivered it. But behind the scenes, away from screens and scrolls, J.D. Vance sat alone in his office long after the lights dimmed in the Capitol. He didn't open the Monroe folder just yet. He didn't brief his staff. He didn't write a tweet or dial a journalist. Instead, he watched the clip. Once, then again. Not to study her words, but to listen to the room. The silence after her statement, the breath people held, the pause too long to be accidental. Then, without a word, he powered off the screen and reached for a drawer most had forgotten existed. Inside was a manila envelope labeled "Voices That Didn't Air," and beneath that, a single post-it note written in JD's own blocky script. "Don't interrupt. Remember. Then show them." The office had emptied, but JD Vance hadn't left. Capitol Hill had its rhythms. Hearings in the morning, statements by lunch, and corridors slowly dimming by dusk. But in his corner office, lit only by a single desk lamp, JD remained motionless. Outside the window, headlights passed like thoughts unspoken. Inside, he sat with the same posture he had during the hearing, still, unreadable. But now something had shifted. Not in expression, but in energy, in decision. He reached for the bottom drawer of a filing cabinet tucked behind his chair. It resisted slightly, the track dry from disuse. When it opened, it revealed a row of manila folders, each marked not with labels, but with names, handwritten in uneven pen strokes, smudged and faded. At the top, scratched in permanent marker, Testimonies never heard. These weren't headlines. These were lives. Veterans, single mothers, small-town business owners. Men and women who once spoke their truths into microphones that weren't plugged in. JD had carried their stories for years, in notebooks, in speeches that never made the cut, in quiet moments between policy and principle. He sifted through them slowly, reverently, until his fingers landed on one. Elijah Thornton, Monroe, Ohio. A steelworker, a veteran, a father. JD hadn't needed to look inside to remember the story. He remembered the eyes, the weariness, the restraint. Elijah hadn't asked for a favor. He hadn't begged for attention. He had just told the truth in the way men do when they have already lost more than they expected and still refuse to lie. JD stared at the folder for a beat, then reached for his personal phone. Not the office line, not for this. 2 rings. Elijah Thornton, came the voice. Steady, the kind of voice that sounded like gravel and warmth at once. Elijah, JD said quietly. It's Vance. There was a pause, recognition settled in. No small talk followed. I figured you'd call eventually, Elijah replied, a tired smile almost audible in the tone. JD nodded even though no one could see him. I watched the hearing, Elijah continued. Saw the clip. Everyone did, JD muttered. There was silence on the line, long enough to feel deliberate. She hit you hard, Elijah finally said. JD didn't deny it. Yeah, he said, but she hit something else harder. He turned the folder in his hand, running his thumb across the worn edge. Then he exhaled, not heavily, but with weight. It's time to tell them what you told me. But this time, JD paused, his voice low but firm. The camera rolls. On the other end, a soft breath, not hesitant, just measured. You sure they'll listen this time? Elijah asked. No, JD replied, but this time they won't be able to pretend they didn't hear. The line stayed quiet for a moment. I still have the photos, Elijah said. The mill, the boys from the line, the classroom and the trailers. JD's jaw tensed. We'll need all of it. I'm not good on camera, Elijah added. You don't need to be, JD said. You just need to be honest. Another pause. I've been honest my whole life, Elijah said. Didn't help much. This time, JD replied, it might help someone else. Then gently, you said it once. They signed away your town in the name of progress. Maybe it's time they see the receipt. Elijah didn't speak again. He didn't need to. JD ended the call. He slid the folder back into the drawer, but this time, he left it slightly open. He didn't need to rehearse what came next. He just needed to listen, because what came next wouldn't be about him. It would be about the voices too many forgot, and the reckoning no one saw coming. The room was nothing special. Wood-paneled walls, a sagging couch, and a ceiling fan that turned just slow enough to be noticed. A small American flag was folded inside a dusty glass case on the mantel. The kind of room you didn't film stories in, unless the story had already passed through it. Elijah Thornton sat center frame. No suit, no prep. Just a navy work jacket zipped halfway, a scar peeking from beneath his collarbone, and a gaze that didn't wander. His hands were heavy, motionless in his lap. The kind of hands that knew what 40 years of heat, weight, and silence felt like. The camera rolled. My name's Elijah Thornton, Monroe, Ohio. Army for 12 years. Steel mill for 22. I've got 2 boys. One's at Ohio State, the other's trying to make his way back from Afghanistan. He glanced at the floor for just a second. I came home from service to a job that felt like purpose. Welding steel, feeding the town, building the things this country still pretends it makes. He reached forward and picked up a photo, grainy, printed from an old home printer. It showed Elijah with 24 workers in front of the Monroe Mill gate. Hard hats, flannel sleeves, sweat on every brow. The kind of picture you frame if no one else ever would. We used to joke that you could hear this plant before you saw it. Machines roaring, forklifts backing up, steel screaming as it bent. It was noise that meant a town was alive. He set the photo down. Then one day we got a letter. Said the plant was being acquired by an international consortium. Said the transition would be seamless. Said this was progress. His voice didn't rise, it dropped. We were told it was part of a global innovation strategy, but what it meant was they gutted the workforce. 70% laid off in 6 months, replaced with robotics shipped in from overseas. Entire departments disappeared overnight. Guys I served with, men who bled in deserts, were suddenly told they were too slow for a machine. He leaned forward slightly, as if needing to make sure the camera understood. And the policy that made that merger legal, that opened the floodgate, was a bill co-sponsored by Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. I remember the headline, "A Bold Vision for American Competitiveness." She called it necessary. She called it forward-thinking. He exhaled through his nose, steady. But she didn't walk through town when the grocery store shut down. She didn't explain to a 5-year-old why there wasn't a bus route to school anymore. She didn't visit the clinic that turned into a vape shop after the mill closed. And she damn sure didn't sit across from me when I had to tell my wife we'd lost the house. He paused, looked at the camera. Not with fury, with fact. She talked progress, he said, his voice low and unwavering. But she signed our past away. The room went quiet. No dramatic music, no cue, just Elijah staring straight into the lens, as if daring the country to look back at him. Not with sympathy, but with accountability. In the silence, you could hear everything America chose to forget, and one man who refused to let it stay buried. The first thing JD noticed wasn't the cold, it was the silence. Not the kind of silence that means peace, but the kind that seeps into places that were never meant to be quiet. A row of 6 rusted shipping containers stood in the gravel lot behind the shuttered elementary school, each painted white, each rimmed in uneven chalk lines where children had once tried to decorate their new classrooms. Inside, the air was metallic. A single space heater buzzed in the corner, doing more for sound than warmth. JD ducked slightly beneath the narrow doorway and entered the first unit. It smelled of hand sanitizer, old crayons, and sheet metal. Desks made from plywood sat unevenly on the sloped floor. A corkboard nailed directly into the steel wall held a drawing of a sun with the words, "We're still shining." 10 children sat bundled in coats. Their teacher, Mrs. Harper, smiled when she saw him. Not with fanfare, but with exhaustion wrapped in grace. "We've been expecting you," she said, motioning toward the back corner. JD didn't speak at first. He just looked. Watched as a boy rubbed his fingers together beneath his desk. Watched as a girl tried to balance a textbook on her lap, the binding held together with duct tape. He nodded to the class, then walked quietly to the side, letting their world go on without interruption. Outside, a local nurse named Carla waited, bundled in a threadbare parka, clipboard in hand. She hadn't worked in the clinic that used to be down the block. She'd run it. Now she worked from her car. "It shut down last August," she said before he even asked. "Funding dried up after the mill closed. Most of our patients couldn't afford the copays anymore, so they just stopped coming, or they left town." JD followed her eyes as she glanced toward a rust-streaked building with boarded windows. "That was our health center. Now it's a vape shop and a coin laundry." He looked back toward the container. "We use thermometers donated by a church in Columbus," Carla added, her voice steady, factual. "I had to deliver insulin in a cooler last winter." JD didn't reach for his notes. He didn't ask for stats. He just asked one thing. "Would you be okay if I recorded a few minutes?" Carla hesitated, not out of suspicion but surprise. "You're the first to ask." JD turned on a small handheld recorder and clipped it to the edge of her clipboard. She kept talking about the uptick in childhood asthma, about kids getting nosebleeds in winter from thin insulation, about how the heating units sometimes shorted out during spelling tests. Back inside, the teacher let him film a few seconds of the children. No faces, just hands on paper, the shuffle of boots on tin flooring, the low murmur of learning trying to survive. He stood in the corner and took it all in, not as footage for a speech, but as evidence that something sacred had been breached. A girl raised her hand to answer a question about state capitals. JD watched as she beamed when she got it right. No applause followed, just a smile, quickly swallowed by the cold. And in that moment, he didn't feel like a senator. He felt like a witness to the cost of forgetting. He stepped outside, the sun dull behind low clouds, and whispered almost to himself, "She said we were moving forward." But where exactly did we leave these kids? No one answered, but the shipping containers did. Standing silent, shivering under a wind they were never meant to face. It was nearly midnight by the time Clara finished syncing the last clip. Her desk lamp cast a soft glow over the keyboard, the rest of the office dim except for the faint hum of her laptop fan. The Senate office was silent, emptied hours ago, save for her and the blinking cursor at the bottom of her editing timeline. She'd been JD's aide for a year, mostly handling constituent letters and policy memos. But this was different. This wasn't paperwork. It was testimony, and she treated it like sacred material. 8 minutes. That's all they agreed on. No background music, no narration, no animation. Just the truth. Unpolished, uncoached, unfiltered. She opened with Elijah's voice, mid-sentence. You could hear the mill before you saw it. That's how you knew the town was alive. Then a slow crossfade to children's hands scribbling answers in the cold of the shipping container classroom. The heater crackled faintly in the background. She cut carefully, not for drama, but for silence, for breaths, for the empty space between words where meaning lives. She layered Carla's words about the shuttered clinic just after a shot of the rusted entrance sign, still flaking red paint. A frame lingered longer than most editors would allow, just enough to make you uncomfortable, just enough to keep you from blinking. By the 7th minute, Clara sat back in her chair, exhaling slowly. No tears, just weight. She didn't title it with anything flashy. She typed history unedited final.move. Then she slid a USB drive into the port, the same one JD had handed her earlier that day. Black, scratched, and barely marked, except for a fading sticker that read simply, "Listen." By the time JD entered the office, his coat still damp from the late-night rain, she had already closed her laptop and placed the USB on his desk. "It's ready," she said, standing. He didn't respond right away. He removed his coat, sat down, and pressed play without another word. Clara didn't leave. They watched in silence. Elijah's voice, the girl in the shipping container naming capitals. Carla's hands adjusting the thermometer inside her coat pocket. No drama, no performance, just lives, ordinary and extraordinary, placed in front of a lens that, for once, didn't flinch. When the screen faded to black, JD didn't speak. He just stared for a few seconds longer than the video lasted, as if waiting for something that had already passed. Clara finally asked softly, "Should we add a closing line? Something about what's at stake?" JD shook his head. "This isn't a counterattack," he said, his voice even. "It's a mirror." He picked up the USB, turning it slowly between his fingers. "We're not here to win an argument," he added. "We're here to make them look and decide if they're okay with what they see." Clara nodded once. JD stood, walked to the window, and watched the faint glow of Capitol Hill reflecting off wet pavement. For the first time in days, he looked not exhausted, but certain. Behind him, the USB sat ready in his hand. Not a weapon, but a witness. Because when the truth has waited this long to be seen, even silence becomes a revolution. They didn't expect him to show up with props. The chamber was already half full when JD Vance entered through the side door. A small black TV tucked under his arm, the kind sold in big box stores for dorm rooms and nursing stations. He carried it like it weighed nothing, though everyone watching felt its presence the moment he placed it on the desk in front of him. There were murmurs, as expected. One congressman raised an eyebrow, nudging his colleague with a smirk. A reporter 3 rows back scribbled, "Stunt," in her notebook. Crockett, seated diagonally across from him, leaned back in her chair, arms folded, eyes scanning him with thinly veiled amusement. Her aide whispered something and chuckled. She didn't bother hiding the eye roll. JD didn't look up. He plugged in the small screen. No tech crew, no flashy monitors, just a USB drive in his right hand, black and scratched. The fading sticker still visible. "Listen." The gavel struck twice. The chairman called the hearing to order. Continuation of the prior session on trade oversight in federal subsidies. The cameras panned slowly, finding their usual rhythm. And then JD spoke. Not loud, not angry, just calm. almost too calm. "Before we rewrite history," he said, standing behind the TV, fingers lightly resting on its edges, "I ask you to see it." Crockett blinked. It was the first time she had. JD continued, "No arguments, no speeches, no commentary, just 8 minutes. That's all I'm asking from this committee, and from the country watching." The chairman glanced around the room. No objections. The space settled. JD pressed play. The screen flickered to life. The voice of Elijah Thornton filled the chamber. Slow, weathered, unmistakably American. There were no graphics, no voiceover, no dramatic music, just his words and the image of a folded flag sitting on his mantle. "Steel worker, 22 years, father of 2, grandson of a man who laid track with his hands." In the frame, Elijah lifted an old photo. The sound of paper brushing against calloused fingertips filled the stillness. Then came the footage of the children. Gloved hands writing on cracked desks, condensation blooming against cold metal walls. A space heater hissed in the corner. No one spoke. Crockett didn't smile this time. A still of Carla appeared next, wrapped in her coat, describing how she delivered insulin in a lunch cooler because the clinic had closed. Her voice didn't tremble. It didn't need to. JD watched the room more than the screen. One aide stopped typing. Another looked down at their lap. A veteran seated in the back row shifted uncomfortably in his seat. For once, the hearing had no side conversations, no background rustle. Just truth. Steady, unflinching. When the screen went black, no one clapped. No one moved. JD waited a moment longer, then unplugged the USB, pocketed it, and said only this: "That's what we left behind while calling it progress. You can vote how you want, but don't say you didn't see it." He didn't look at Crockett as he sat down. He didn't need to, because the smirks were gone, the whispers silenced, and for the first time since her headline moment, she wasn't the one controlling the narrative. Now the country had something else to remember, and JD had just begun. The room didn't breathe. The TV, no larger than a cafeteria tray, now held every eye in the chamber. Not because it demanded attention, but because it refused to perform. It simply showed. The screen opened with Elijah's hands, rough, broad, one resting over the other, fingers stiff from years of welding and winter. His voice came low and steady, with no music underneath, no captioning to dramatize what was already real. "I worked at Monroe Steel since I was 23. That plant raised 2 boys, paid off a mortgage, and made me feel like I was worth something." Cut to the photograph of Elijah and his co-workers in front of the factory gates, some smiling, some squinting in the sunlight. The sound of steel presses in the background faded slowly into silence as the image froze, and his voice continued. "They called it progress, but progress meant packing our lockers into cardboard and watching strangers padlock the gates." A flicker, then a cold, still image of the shipping container classroom. JD had chosen not to lead with it, but to let it arrive halfway through, when the room had settled enough to feel discomfort more sharply. The camera panned slowly across the interior. Desks nailed into the floor. Windows fogged over with breath. A child in mittens raising her hand to spell Ohio. In the background, the teacher's voice trembled slightly as she called out questions. Nothing political, just spelling and subtraction. The heater hummed like a sad kind of applause. Then Carla's voice, clipped from her conversation with JD, filled the chamber. "We lost the clinic last year, couldn't pay staff, couldn't restock medicine. Now I deliver insulin out of a cooler I keep in my trunk." A still of Carla followed, her eyes fixed beyond the camera, wind lifting her collar. No tears, no performance. Just a woman trying to do what systems had forgotten to. The video didn't raise its voice, but the room's pulse changed. You could feel it. The aide who had once chuckled during JD's entrance now tapped their pen nervously against a legal pad. Another leaned back and crossed their arms, defensive posture disguised as neutrality. A congresswoman in the second row lowered her gaze when the shot cut to a hallway of lockers, dusty and unused, labeled with children's names written in faded marker. Then came the final image, a slow, deliberate zoom on a red brick building, The sign above the doorway had once read, Monroe Family Health Clinic. The letters had chipped, but one phrase remained perfectly intact, a bronze plaque near the entrance, polished by time and weather. It read, "This facility supported by the American Trade Expansion Act." The clip held on that frame. 10 seconds, maybe 12. Long enough for the eyes in the room to register the name. Long enough for the association to burn itself into memory, because everyone knew who had stood behind that act, who had praised it on Sunday talk shows, who had introduced it on the House floor as a step into the modern global economy. Jasmine Crockett sat frozen, not because she didn't remember, but because she did. She'd called it visionary, bold. She had smiled in front of that very clinic during a campaign stop. There were photos, and now the same place was closed, its name still carrying the echo of policy dressed as progress. The video faded to black. No music, no credits, just silence. Not the awkward kind, but the kind that comes when truth is finally inarguable. JD didn't move. Neither did anyone else. Because in those 8 minutes, the room hadn't watched a rebuttal. They had witnessed evidence. When the screen went black, no one moved. The room that had once buzzed with side chatter, clicking pens and quiet coughs now felt suspended, as if time itself had stepped out for air. Even the ceiling lights seemed dimmer, their usual glare softened by the weight of what had just unfolded. J.D. Vance didn't sit. He let the silence linger. Not for drama, not for control, but because the moment didn't belong to him, it belonged to the people on that screen, the steel worker, the children, the nurse, and the absence of everything they had lost. Finally, he stepped forward. No note cards, no podium. Just a man in a suit standing next to a powered-down TV, one hand loosely in his pocket, the other still gently resting on the top corner of the monitor, as if anchoring himself to what had just been said. He looked out, not scanning the room, not challenging anyone, but just looking. The way someone does when they've seen something they can't unsee. And then softly he said, "I didn't come to win. I came so people like them would be remembered." That was it. No call to action, no applause line, no follow-up. Just one sentence that didn't ask for agreement. It demanded recognition. Across the room, chairs remained perfectly still. No papers shuffled, no whispers rose. Even the C-SPAN cameras, usually robotic in their panning, lingered just a few seconds longer on JD's face as he stepped back and returned to his seat. He didn't nod. He didn't glance toward Crockett. He didn't need to, because the line he had spoken wasn't aimed at her or at the committee. It was aimed at the space between government and humanity, the space where people like Elijah had been forgotten, repackaged, and erased in the name of economic advancement. Crockett, for the first time in 2 weeks, wasn't smiling. She wasn't angry either, not visibly, but something in her expression had changed. The sharpness in her eyes was still there, but dulled, as if uncertainty had crept into a place once fortified by confidence. Her fingers tapped slowly against the wood of her desk, an unconscious rhythm, the kind people do when they're trying to look calm but feel the floor shifting beneath them. A staffer leaned in to whisper something in her ear. She didn't respond, just stared at the now dark screen, as if trying to rewind the images in her own head. Across the room, a few aides exchanged glances, but no one dared speak. The only sound came from the hallway beyond the chamber, a distant echo of footsteps, like the world had resumed its pace just outside these walls. But inside, everything had slowed. And in that quiet, something rare had taken hold. Not victory, not defeat, but reflection. Because it wasn't just a line that JD had spoken. It was a quiet indictment of how far the conversation had drifted from those who couldn't afford to be in the room. A reminder that policy wasn't supposed to be about who scored the final point. It was supposed to be about who got left behind. No one clapped, but for the first time, no one doubted what had just been heard. And no one, especially not Jasmine Crockett, would ever forget who had said it. The clip hadn't even cooled before the cracks began to show. 3 days after J.D. Vance's quiet declaration echoed through the hearing chamber, the first leak surfaced, not from an opponent, not from a reporter digging through records, but from inside Jasmine Crockett's own office. The message arrived anonymously to 3 inboxes, 2 journalists and a policy watchdog. No preamble, no signature. Just a single line in the subject field. You should see what we were told not to ask about. Attached were screenshots, 9 in total, meeting summaries, PAC correspondence, internal memos marked "Do Not Forward," line items from a donation spreadsheet, cross-referenced with trade vote timestamps, names of lobbyists tied to multinational manufacturing firms, firms that had publicly supported the American Trade Expansion Act, firms that had directly benefited from the offshoring Crockett, once dismissed as transitional realignment. It wasn't a smoking gun. It was an archive of slow-burning matches, the kind that don't explode, but corrode. The story didn't break immediately. It leaked. Whispers began in the early afternoon. A political blog with 200,000 followers posted a headline, "Something's brewing in Crockett's camp." A Capitol Hill reporter tweeted, "Hearing rumors of internal unrest in the Crockett team. Stay tuned." By 7 p.m., Politico was calling it a developing personnel rift. By 10 p.m., MSNBC had gone live with it. The segment aired just after the late-night commentary block, hosted by anchor Melinda Reyes, sharp-tongued, respected, and unafraid to cut where it stung. She leaned forward in her chair, voice low, eyes serious. "Tonight, we're asking a question no one thought we'd ask just 2 weeks ago. Did Representative Jasmine Crockett trade towns for trade deals?" Then came the visuals, cropped emails, lobby meeting dates, a donor roundtable scheduled the week before the Trade Expansion Act passed the House, held at a private club in D.C., with the guest list now public, and Jasmine's name right there at the top. Reyes continued, "Sources inside the Congresswoman's office confirm that questions about offshoring were actively discouraged in internal briefings. One aide, who has since resigned, claims they were told, quote, 'Don't complicate the message. We're forward-facing.'" And just like that, the tide began to shift. Crockett's communications team issued a short, vaguely worded statement. Congresswoman Crockett remains committed to inclusive growth and transparent governance. But it landed flat. No names, no denials, no acknowledgement of what had just aired. By morning, 3 former staffers had gone on background with media outlets, corroborating key details. One of them, a policy researcher named Alex Ruiz, posted a single sentence to his personal account. "Sometimes silence in a hearing is louder than applause in a campaign." The tweet went viral in under an hour. Within days, J.D. Vance's line, "I came so people like them would be remembered," had been clipped, paired with footage of Elijah, the kids in containers, and the shuttered clinic. But now it aired next to headlines about Crockett's lobby ties. Now the story wasn't just a moral one, it was political, tangible, costly. And through it all, JD said nothing. No press releases, no gloating tweets, no interviews. Because when the foundation starts to crack on its own, all you have to do is stand still and let the truth echo. By the end of the week, the conversation had shifted, and not in whispers. The headlines changed tone first. Rising Star faces questions on trade ethics became Crockett's office in damage control after leak. On social media, hashtags once filled with praise, hashtag Crockett crushes, hashtag bold future, quietly faded as a new one emerged, hashtag sold us out. It started small. A veteran in Pennsylvania posted a video in his garage, wearing an old Union jacket, hands blackened from auto repair. He stared directly into the camera and said, "We served our country. We worked in the factories she called outdated, and now she's taking checks from the same people who shut them down. Don't call that progress. Call it what it is, abandonment." His words hit harder than cable commentary. The video reached over 400,000 views in 2 days. Soon, a national veterans coalition, one that had previously endorsed Crockett for her work on small business reinvestment, released a terse statement. "We are withdrawing our endorsement of Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, effective immediately. Policy innovation should never come at the cost of betrayal." The decision sent shockwaves through both sides of the aisle. This wasn't a political group. It was a respected bipartisan organization, and they rarely retracted support. Crockett's team attempted to pivot. They posted a new campaign video with images of her walking through job training centers, shaking hands in hard hats. But it fell flat. The comments section flooded instantly. You already made your choice. Where were those photos when the mill shut down? Now you're listening? Pundits debated whether she could survive the news cycle. Her supporters accused J.D. Vance of orchestrating the leaks. But no one could explain why he hadn't said a word. That silence became a strategy. At a morning briefing, one of J.D.'s aides placed a list of interview requests on his desk. CNN, CBS, even Fox News offering a sit-down. J.D. glanced at the sheet, then slid it aside. They're ready for a victory lap, the aide said. This is the moment. J.D. didn't even look up from his notes. Let her keep talking, he said evenly. I'll let the footage speak. And so he did. The clip, now titled History Unedited by viewers, was passed around more like a testimony than content. It appeared in churches, school staff meetings, and even town halls unrelated to the original hearing. Teachers played it during civics lessons. Pastors referenced it in sermons. In one community forum in Indiana, a woman stood and said, I don't agree with J.D. on a lot, but he remembered us when no one else did. That line was quoted by USA Today. Crockett, once heralded for her poise and bite, now found herself being asked different questions. Not about the hearing, about the emails, the donors, the clinic. Her team tried to pivot again, calling the coverage unfair, the narrative distorted. But the more she spoke, the more it spread. And across the aisle, J.D. simply went back to work. No press tour, no stage moments, just meetings in closed rooms with factory reps, education committees, and housing advocates. When asked by a local station if he'd respond to the wave of attention, he smiled politely and said, this was never about attention. It was about memory. And in a political moment drowning in noise, his restraint became its own kind of thunder. It didn't come with cameras, no flashing alerts, no podium press conference. Just a quietly worded memo circulated internally among House leadership and select committee members late on a Wednesday evening. A single page stamped confidential with 2 short sentences near the bottom that changed everything. Representative Jasmine Crockett is hereby summoned to appear before the House Committee on Ethics. Subject matter, undisclosed lobbying correspondence and policy influence relating to H.R. 2284. There were no leaks, at least not right away, but Washington had its own kind of radar, and within 12 hours, inboxes across Capitol Hill buzzed with the same subject line, Ethics Summons Confirmed. By midday, the news had reached the press. Axios ran it first with an exclusive header, Crockett faces ethics inquiry over trade legislation ties. The story spread within minutes, picked up by AP and Reuters. CNN followed, then NBC. And by evening, it was the lead on both coasts. Her spokesperson responded quickly. We are aware of the inquiry and welcome the opportunity to clarify the Congresswoman's record. She has done nothing improper, unethical, or inappropriate. This is a routine matter blown out of proportion. But it didn't sound like strength. It sounded like choreography. The clip of Elijah's voice once again resurfaced. News outlets replayed the line about cardboard boxes and padlocked gates, pairing it with stills from the leaked emails. A side-by-side graphic showed a donation from a PAC supporting overseas relocation policies, dated 1 week before Crockett's floor speech praising the very same bill. The optics weren't damning, they were surgical. Within hours, 3 committee members from her own party declined to defend her on air. One issued a vague statement about accountability across the board. Another dodged a question entirely. And J.D. Vance, he still hadn't spoken. Not in person, not on television. But at 4:37 p.m., his office released a written statement. Just 3 lines, posted without fanfare, buried on the official press site beneath scheduling updates and district bulletins. No signature flourish, no headline, just words. If a factory dies in silence, was it ever part of history to begin with? That's the question we failed to ask. Now it's the one we can no longer ignore. Within 20 minutes, that quote had made the rounds. Pundits called it poetic. Critics called it opportunistic. But most agreed, it didn't sound like a soundbite. It sounded like a sentence etched in bronze. The Ethics Committee refused to comment on the scope of the inquiry. Crockett's team doubled down, issuing new talking points, pushing her supporters to defend the future against fear-mongering. But the numbers told a different story. Online sentiment continued to slip. Donors paused contributions. A respected labor columnist from The Atlantic published a blistering piece titled, "Progress Without a Pulse, The Crockett Dilemma." And behind it all, J.D. Vance kept working. He made no threats. He offered no condemnation. He simply kept pointing to the original footage, again and again, until no one could pretend it hadn't been seen. And while Crockett prepared for what her team called a clarification session, those watching knew better. Because what she would walk into wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a reckoning. And this time, there wouldn't be any applause waiting on the other side. The auditorium lights burned brighter than usual. Too clean, too theatrical, like they were trying to bleach away the weight in the room. 3 candidates stood behind their podiums. One of them, Jasmine Crockett, wore red again. Not bold this time, defensive. This was supposed to be her comeback, the final debate of the cycle. Her campaign staff had pushed for it relentlessly, hoping to wrestle the conversation back from the ethics cloud, from the headlines, from the ghost of a USB clip that refused to die. She had rehearsed for this. Sound bites sharpened, pivots prepared. She knew which questions would come. On policy, on her record, even on the leaked emails. Her team had armed her with rebuttals. She walked on the stage steady, chin high, voice measured. And for the first 20 minutes, it almost worked. She spoke of future-proof industries. She promised investment in education, clean energy, AI research. She smiled when it fit. She fired back when she had to. She even landed a few solid lines. The applause was polite, but not empty. It was enough for a moment to believe she might escape the undertow, until the moderator adjusted his glasses, held up a sheet of paper, and cleared his throat. "We received a letter," he said, "from a local resident in Monroe, Ohio. He requested it be read publicly if time allowed. It's brief." Crockett shifted, her eyes narrowing, not in panic, but recognition. She knew the name before it was spoken. "Elijah Thornton," the moderator said. "Veteran, former steelworker." The paper rustled softly in his hands. "To Representative Crockett, you once said on television that we were outdated, that our way of life belonged to the past. But we were never asking to be saved. We were asking not to be erased. I worked 22 years building something. Not just steel, but community. The factory's gone. The clinic's gone. The school barely breathes. And you call it bold policy. We call it abandonment." The moderator paused just briefly, enough to let the air change, then read the last line. "You forgot us. But we didn't forget who let us down." Silence swept the room. The camera cut to Crockett's face. Her expression didn't crumble, but something behind her eyes shifted. She opened her mouth to respond, then hesitated. There was no applause, no interjection, just stillness. One of the other candidates glanced down, uncomfortable. A few audience members sat forward, bracing for what might come next. But Crockett didn't speak right away. When she did, her voice was quieter than before, controlled, but no longer commanding. "I understand the pain," she said slowly, "but we can't move backward just because forward has been hard. I didn't forget Monroe. I believed we could offer them more." It was the wrong answer, not because it was cruel, but because it sounded practiced. Hollow. The weight of the moment demanded confession. She gave calculation. The moderator didn't respond. He just nodded and moved on to the next question. But the damage had already settled. The clip would be replayed 100,000 times in the next 24 hours. Not the answer. Not the apology that never came. Just the final line of Elijah's letter, spoken in a room full of promises. "You forgot us. But we didn't forget who let us down." It was the moment her campaign stopped moving forward and started falling in place, behind everything it had once ignored. The backdrop was carefully chosen. An American flag flanked by 2 clean, royal blue banners reading, "Moving Forward Together." Crockett stood at the podium, framed in flattering light, her voice calm, her blazer crisp, her tone pre-measured like every syllable had been drafted in war rooms and edited by pollsters. She had rehearsed it dozens of times. The appeal to unity, the rebuke of misinformation, the pivot back to policy. "This moment has been twisted," she said early into her remarks. "The video that aired, the sound bites that followed, and the letter read during the debate, it's all a snapshot of a much bigger picture, one that frankly has been misrepresented." Reporters nodded, fingers poised over keyboards, but the energy in the room was tight, controlled, skeptical. Crockett pressed forward. "I've never turned my back on the working class. I've never profited from policy meant to harm anyone. I've worked tirelessly to bring innovation and jobs to communities that need them most. Progress isn't always easy. It doesn't always look the same, but I stand by my record." Flashbulbs snapped, reporters raised hands, and her staff stood near the edge of the riser, heads tilted, watching every cue. But then the moment cracked. A rustle behind the press row. At first, barely noticeable. A whisper of movement. Then a stir. A pause. Heads began to turn, not because someone shouted, but because of the stillness. There, near the back of the room, just beyond the cameras, stood a child. 10, maybe 11 years old. Wrapped in an oversized jacket, too thin for the weather, with faded mittens clutched around a piece of poster board. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't stage. But the writing, hand-scrawled in blue marker, stopped the room cold. "Am I worth your vote now?" Crockett saw it. The podium was several feet above the child's line of sight, but she saw it clearly. Her words faltered, not into silence, but into something worse. Hesitation. The next sentence didn't come. Her hands, resting confidently just minutes before, now trembled. Subtle at first, then visibly. She shifted her weight, glanced at her staff, and reached for the edge of the lectern, as if the wood itself might hold her steady. Reporters turned, lenses adjusted. The moment hadn't been on the schedule, but now it had eclipsed everything on it. The child stood quietly, no parent in view. Just holding the sign, looking up at the woman who had once said their world was yesterday's America. Crockett tried again. She began, then stopped. The next sentence never arrived. Instead, she stepped back from the podium. A staffer approached, whispering urgently. She shook her head, firm at first, then softer, like the resistance had given way to realization. The microphones caught a single sentence, spoken off script as she turned away. "I wasn't ready for that." And then she left. The room didn't erupt. It didn't explode. It just froze. One of the reporters lowered their camera. Another slowly took off their headset. The live feed cut to anchor desks scrambling to interpret what they had just witnessed. But the image, the child, the sign, the woman who turned away, needed no commentary. It spread faster than any prepared statement ever could. Clipped, shared, reposted. Not as scandal, not as spectacle, but as proof. Proof that something had been broken, not by opposition, but by something far more powerful. Presence. And this time, there was no spinning the silence. The video didn't come through a press conference. There was no podium, no media outlet, no campaign slogan superimposed across the bottom of the screen. It came late, just after 10 p.m., posted to Jasmine Crockett's personal account, not her official one. No one was notified in advance. There was no music, no title card, just her, sitting at a kitchen table, lit by a soft lamp in the corner. No makeup, no blazer, just a simple sweater and a glass of water untouched beside her. She looked into the camera, not like a politician addressing a crowd, but like someone recording a message they didn't want to rehearse a second time. She started without greeting. "I've thought a lot about what to say," she began, "and more importantly, how to say it without making it about me again." She exhaled softly once, before continuing. "I didn't lose to J.D. Vance. I lost to the truth I ignored." There was no teleprompter. Her eyes never shifted off the lens. Her voice didn't shake, but it had none of the sharpness that once cut through chambers and interview panels. It was quieter now, not defeated, but stripped. "I told myself I was moving this country forward, that hard decisions had to be made, that some towns had to sacrifice so others could rise. What I didn't ask, what I refused to ask, was who made that decision and who paid the cost." She paused, pressing her fingertips together. "You saw the footage. You heard Elijah. You saw that little girl holding a sign, and I did too. Not for the first time, but for the first time with my guard down. And I knew I couldn't explain it away. Her breath caught slightly, just enough to notice. So tonight, I'm stepping aside. I'm suspending my campaign for re-election. Not because I was forced to, not because I lost support, but because I finally listened, really listened, and realized I wasn't the voice they needed anymore. The video ran 6 minutes in total. She never named JD again after the opening line, never blamed her staff, never questioned the inquiry. She ended with this: I've had the privilege to serve, but it's a greater privilege to know when to stop speaking and start hearing. To those I left behind, I hear you now, and I'm sorry it took this long. She reached forward, pressed a button, and the screen went black. The video was viewed 9.3 million times in the first 12 hours. Reactions flooded in. Some praised her courage. Others called it too little, too late, but no one said it wasn't real. The next morning, the hearing chamber opened as scheduled. Staffers arranged placards, powered on microphones, poured coffee into paper cups. Committee members filtered in. Cameras adjusted their angles. J.D. Vance entered just before the start, papers under one arm, eyes steady. He passed by her seat without pause. It was empty. The nameplate still stood. Representative Jasmine Crockett, but the chair behind it sat untouched. The microphone blinked softly, waiting for a voice that wouldn't come. No announcement was made. No replacement yet named. But everyone noticed. Not because someone was missing, but because for once, silence had done what argument could not. It had left a mark. And as the session began, no one had to say what had changed. They'd seen it. The gates of Monroe Steel creaked as they opened, slower than before but steady. The rusted chains that once hung like a tombstone over the entrance were gone, replaced by fresh black paint and a newly installed badge reader that still beeped with slight hesitation. The morning light hit the sheet metal walls with a soft, golden gleam, as if the building itself were waking up after a long sleep. J.D. Vance stood a few paces back from the entrance, hands in his coat pockets, eyes fixed on the factory floor beyond. There were no TV crews, no podiums, no branded step-and-repeat backdrops. Just 30 folding chairs, a line of men and women in work boots, and a length of ribbon held taut between two ladders. On one side of the ribbon, new hires. On the other, the man who had promised not to forget them. The initiative had passed 2 months earlier, tucked inside a quiet bill under the name American Local Industry Revitalization Grant Program. JD hadn't announced it with press releases. He hadn't needed to. The funds had gone directly to the places that never made national maps, towns like Monroe. The grant didn't restore the entire plant, but it reopened one section. Welding and finishing. Enough for 42 jobs to start. More to come. Elijah was first in line. He wore his old Navy jacket, newly stitched at the shoulder, and a hard hat that had once collected dust in his garage. His 2 sons stood nearby, one home from Afghanistan, the other on break from college, watching their father return to a place most believed would never draw breath again. As JD took the scissors from a maintenance supervisor, the small group gathered didn't cheer. They didn't clap. They just stood still, reverent. Not for him, but for what the moment meant. He looked down at the ribbon for a second longer than expected, then cut. No words. Just that soft snip, the kind you could miss if you weren't paying attention. But everyone there heard it. Later, a local paper would run a photo. JD standing next to Elijah, both shaking hands with simple smiles. The caption read only, Monroe Steel, line 1, restarted. JD toured the line afterward. The machines weren't loud yet, still being recalibrated, but the hum was there, faint and growing. Workers tested equipment. Pallets were stacked. A break room had been refurbished with a new coffee machine and a stack of fresh hard hats with tags still attached. A young veteran named Lisa handed JD a wrench. Brand new, she said with a grin. They said we get to use the first set. JD nodded, turned the wrench once in his hand, then gave it back. Make it last, he replied. Elijah walked beside him to the exit. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The air smelled of oil and possibility, and sometimes that was enough. At the door, JD paused. "You said something once," he murmured, "that you weren't asking to be saved, just not to be erased." Elijah nodded slowly, the weight in his shoulders easing just slightly. "Well," JD said, eyes scanning the factory behind them, "looks like you're being written back in." And with that, he stepped outside, the wind catching the edges of his coat, the hum of machinery now following him out. Not as noise, but as proof. Not everything lost had to stay gone. Some things, if remembered loudly enough, could return. The sun slipped through the high windows of J.D. Vance's office, casting long golden lines across the shelves, the flags, and the worn leather chair he almost never sat in. In a quiet corner, a new frame had been placed. Simple walnut wood without polish. Inside was Elijah's letter. The original. Yellowed slightly at the edges, folded twice with handwriting that was careful but tired. The top of the letter read, "You once said voices get lost. I want mine to count for something." JD stood before it silently, hands in his pockets, as if the letter might speak again. He remembered the day it had been handed to him. Elijah had pressed it into his palm after the town hall meeting, just before the lights went down. No cameras, no speeches. Just a man who'd spent decades watching his town be sold piece by piece, hoping someone would listen without needing applause. Beside the letter, mounted just below in a second frame, was a small note, this one printed on pale green construction paper in shaky marker handwriting. "Thank you for seeing us before anyone else did." There was no name sign, just a heart, and in the corner, a sticker of an American flag, half peeled. It had come from the child in the shipping container classroom, the one with frostbitten fingers who had offered JD a crayon that day. The teacher had mailed it weeks later, folded into a thank you card with no return address. But JD knew. He didn't need a name. Visitors often asked what the letter meant. Some assumed it was symbolic, a political artifact maybe. But JD never gave the same answer twice. Sometimes he just said, "It's from someone who stayed when it got hard." Other times he would gesture toward it and say, "That's the voice that rewrote the hearing." But most of the time, when the room was empty and the lights dimmed after hours, he would sit nearby, sipping coffee gone cold, and let the silence hang. Because that letter, that story, wasn't for the cameras. It was for the forgotten. In one hearing, 8 minutes of truth had challenged an entire narrative. In one child's note, years of policy failure had been boiled down to a simple question. Did you see us before it was too late? JD never forgot the answer. And now, framed in quiet reverence, those two pieces of paper sat side by side, not as trophies, not as reminders of victory, but as proof that someone, somewhere, chose to speak when it would have been easier to stay quiet. The office was quiet, save for the soft tapping of keys and the low hum of a dusty space heater in the corner. It was well past 7 p.m., but Clara hadn't noticed. The screen in front of her glowed with a paused video. Elijah's voice mid-sentence, the steel plant in the background, and children huddled in a shipping container with coats zipped to the chin. Her fingers hovered over the mouse. "Export file," the button read. "Final render." She blinked. Her eyes were tired, but her mind was still alert, sharpened by a week of sleepless nights spent trimming sound bites, adjusting tone, and removing even the hint of political theater. The footage wasn't about showing off, it was about showing truth. A soft knock on the glass broke the moment. JD entered without speaking, a manila envelope in his hand. He sat down across from her, not at his desk, but in the visitor's chair. No tie, shirt sleeves rolled. In his other hand was a mug of lukewarm tea, half full, untouched. "I wrote you something," he said, handing her the envelope. Clara hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a single sheet of letterhead, typed, but at the bottom was JD's own handwriting in dark blue ink. "You didn't just edit a video, Clara. You edited the story we tell ourselves about America. You helped us remember what we stopped looking at, and you made sure the ones who stayed finally got seen." Clara swallowed hard. For a moment she couldn't speak. She looked up, and JD gave her a small nod. The kind that didn't need words to say, "You did it right." The cursor blinked on the screen, waiting for a decision. She turned back to it, heart heavier now, but in a way that felt good, solid, true. She clicked the mouse. Upload, title, history, part 2. Description, unfiltered, uncut, unforgotten. Within seconds, the file began processing. Clara leaned back in her chair, letting out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. JD stood and headed toward the door. Just before leaving, he paused and looked back. "It's not the loudest voices that last," he said. "It's the ones that carry something real." The door closed softly behind him. Clara turned once more to the screen. Outside, the Capitol lights flickered against the night. Inside, the digital bar slowly filled. 1%, 2%, 3%. But what it truly carried was immeasurable. The story wasn't just about bills and debates. It was about the echo of a veteran's voice, a child's sign, and the silent decision made in an edit suite long after the camera stopped rolling. And somewhere in a forgotten town with cold metal classrooms, someone would see themselves finally reflected in what America chose to remember. The Capitol was quieter than usual. No press clusters, no echoing footsteps of aides darting between hearings. Just the hush of marble and history breathing in a long corridor lined with glass frames. J.D. Vance walked slowly, hands in his coat pockets. His shoes tapped softly against the floor, the rhythm unhurried. This hallway wasn't one tourists wandered through. It was the corridor of legislation, where framed bills hung like museum pieces. Some yellowed with age. Others looked barely red. He paused halfway down the hall. His eyes moved over the names. The Affordable Urban Renewal Act, the Federal Energy Equity Resolution. Bills once fought for on camera, then filed away in silence. Forgotten not because they failed, but because the people they aimed to serve didn't have lobbyists to keep their names alive. Then his gaze landed on a newer frame, the glass still clean, the ink not yet faded. Veterans Reemployment and Local Investment Act, sponsored by Senator J.D. Vance, ROH, passed by bipartisan vote. No fanfare, no commemorative plaque, just black text on cream paper, bordered by a thin gold frame. But it meant something. He knew it did. This was the bill that had reopened part of Elijah's mill, that redirected federal small business grants to hollowed-out towns, that listed veteran employment as a national redevelopment metric, not a charitable checkbox. He stared at it for a long moment, not because it was his name beneath the title, but because of the names that would never appear. Elijah, Teresa, the nurse who worked without supplies, the boy in the shipping container who held up the sign. Their voices weren't in the language of legal clauses, but they were in the ink, in the reason it passed. A group of interns passed by in a soft shuffle, whispering to each other about a lunch meeting. One looked at JD, did a double take, then lowered his voice. JD didn't turn around. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. It was creased from handling, the edges worn. Elijah's original handwritten letter. He tucked it behind the frame, just enough to show the edge. Not hidden, but not claimed either. Just there. As he turned to leave, he caught his reflection in the glass. Not the senator, not the soundbite. Just a man who'd once promised a factory worker. This time, they'll hear you. He walked on, the hallway stretching ahead, and behind him among the gallery of forgotten bills, one now carried the memory of the unheard. The overhead lights hummed softly in the civics classroom of a small high school just outside Des Moines. Afternoon sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long rectangles across scuffed desks. Students leaned back in their chairs, some arms crossed, others tapping pencils, waiting to be dismissed. But their teacher, Mrs. Sanderson, stood at the front, remote in hand, gaze steady. "Before we end today," she said, "I want you to see something." The screen blinked. A video began to play. There was no opening music, no graphics, just J.D. Vance standing in the Capitol hearing room, voice steady but low, introducing the video of Elijah, the shuttered clinic, the children huddled in cold containers. Then came his final words. "I didn't come to win. I came so people like them would be remembered." Silence settled over the room like dust. No one looked at their phones. Not one whispered. When the screen went black, a long pause followed. Finally, a hand went up. A boy in the third row. Ryan, always blunt, always curious. Why didn't anyone stop her? He asked, glancing around the room as if unsure if he'd missed something obvious. I mean, if people knew she signed the bill that hurt them? Mrs. Sanderson didn't answer right away. She walked to the whiteboard, picked up a blue marker, and wrote in all caps, "Who stood?" Then she turned and said, "Because no one stood until someone finally did." Another pause, this one heavier, a girl in the front. Maria, with sharp eyes and quiet confidence, leaned forward. But it wasn't loud. He didn't yell. Mrs. Sanderson smiled. No, but sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay calm, bring proof, and let the silence do the talking. She clicked off the screen and added one more sentence beneath the question. Truth doesn't need volume. It just needs space. As students gathered their bags and slipped out the door, a few glanced back at the screen, as if expecting the video to play again. It didn't, but the words lingered, tucked between their notebooks and thoughts. Words from a man they hadn't known before today. A man who chose not to shout, but to stand. And in that quiet classroom in Iowa, the ripple of that stand had reached farther than even he knew. The building had long since emptied. The marble corridors that once echoed with sharp heels and urgent whispers now lay hushed beneath the soft hum of evening lights. J.D. Vance sat alone in his office, the city skyline stretching beyond the windows, blurred slightly by the faint smudge of rain. His coat hung on the chair behind him. The tie had been loosened hours ago. The desk was quiet, cleared of the day's clutter, save for one worn leather notebook he had carried since before his Senate run. It wasn't meant for speeches or bills, just thoughts that didn't belong on podiums. He opened it slowly, turned past scribbled drafts and scattered quotes, and landed on a fresh page. Then in his careful hand, he wrote, "Legacy isn't the seat you held. It's the people who stood because you did." He paused for a moment, staring at the sentence, then underlined it with the weight of a man who had seen power used both to elevate and erase. No editor would see these words. No staffer would clip them for a press kit. They weren't meant for Twitter or the evening news. They were meant for the quiet, for the space that comes after noise has died down. J.D. closed the notebook and leaned back, listening to the stillness around him. Somewhere far below, the Capitol clock struck the hour, its low chime barely audible. There were no headlines waiting to break, no applause waiting to rise. Just the soft scrape of the chair as he stood up, the rustle of a coat being shrugged on, and the slow, thoughtful footsteps of a man walking out of a room not to be remembered for what it held, but for what it chose to release. And as the door clicked shut behind him, the words on the page remained, untouched, unpolished, but true. What makes a legacy last? This story reminds us it isn't power or podiums, it's the quiet decisions made when no one's watching. J.D. Vance's final note isn't about political triumph, but moral clarity. He doesn't seek applause, he seeks impact. The contrast between silence and substance is striking. A man who chooses reflection over reaction, action over attention. In an age of viral clips and performative politics, this ending dares to suggest that real leadership is often invisible, but deeply felt. It leaves us with a question not just about him, but about ourselves. If no one sees your stand, would you still take it? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.